The Future Politics Panel.
Yeah, it's time for our Future Politics panel. This is the part of the show which I'm really keen about, to get young people who are involved and active in politics to espouse their views. Joining us this morning, Jonathan Gibson, who is a political commentator, and new to us this morning is Callum Robertson, who's a Liberal Democrat campaigner. He's also a teacher. Good morning to the two of you.
Good morning.
You look very festive now. So.
Thank you so much.
Yes, good. Very nice that you're both in. Shall we start talking about strikes this morning? I mean, clearly, it seems to me that we are in broken Britain. I've just read out all of the list of those people going on strike: baggage handlers, border force personnel, passport control, air traffic controllers, postal workers, railway workers, nurses. Many people actually, Jonathan, saying that, and I've asked, who do you have the most sympathy with? And many people are actually saying they have the biggest sympathy with the rest of the public.
No, absolutely. It's a really, really difficult scenario, you know, and like, not to put it down on Christmas, but, you know, there are more people going to food banks, there are people really struggling across the country, people in and out of these jobs that are going on strike. In terms of the particular group that are going on strike, probably the one that I have the most sympathy for would be nurses. You know, if you look at the pay cuts or the rate, if their pay was to increase over time in line with how they've been increasing across other sectors, you know, they'd be near at 40k, they're paid 20% less than those in the US, 30% less than those in the Netherlands. They've obviously, you know, we've been clapping for them, but clapping doesn't really pay their bills. So I do have sympathy for them, and look, I think their negotiations are a starting point. I don't think they're saying, you know, there have to be 19% increases.
I mean, it's an interesting point. Callum, would you agree with that? I mean, certainly asking for 19.2% at a time when obviously inflation is at 10.7%, it is coming down, but many people are saying this is just way out of kilter. You've got the independent pay review body saying 4.75%, the nurses wanting 19%, and Dr. Rennie and I are both deeply concerned about what happens to patient care here, because particularly at this time of year, do you think it's right that nurses strike at this time of year?
I think it's, to answer the first, like the original point about actually who do we have most sympathy with, it's really, really important we don't play divide and rule here. I know it's quite easy to, but actually, if you look at why nurses are going on strike, it's the first time nurses have striked like this, I believe, about 100 years.
That's right.
That is astronomical, and actually what's driven nurses to that action, I think actually we need to be looking at, because it's all well and good addressing it in the here and now, getting a temporary pay deal, whatever in place, but actually the really, really important thing to my mind is actually addressing the root cause of it, because that's where decent policy lies, is actually in tackling the root cause of those issues.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree, but you see, they did some sneaky things here. They used a disaggregated vote for a start. They didn't take the whole number. What they did is split it into separate trusts, and so therefore you've actually got something like 44 trusts, which is 1 in 4, which is then balloting for strike action. I don't disagree, by the way. I think nurses should be paid more. The issue is this the right time? Given that it's winter, we have huge pressures on the NHS. You've got this amazing, outrageous number of people waiting for elective procedures. The whole thing is falling over as it is. Is the timing right? And that's the bit about the public sympathy.
No, that's fair enough. If you look at the polling, the public's with the nurses at the moment. The polling is pretty categorical on that, I believe. But actually, is it the right time? Well, that's not really, I don't think, for us to decide. If you want to have a say on nurses' industrial action, become a nurse and join a nursing union. As a teacher, I would say in teachers' industrial action, because I'm a teacher and a member of the teaching union. Now, people can cry and whinge about it, but actually, let's be honest, nurses have democratically taken that decision in line with the legislation.
OK, let me put you on the spot as a Lib Dem. What sort of level of pay would you give them? Is there a policy from the Lib Dems?
Yeah, so there is a policy. The exact number escapes me, but actually, we're talking about inflation in line with inflation pay rises.
So about 10.7%.
Yeah, that's a fair amount. And it's also, coincidentally, a halfway house between the independent pay review body and the sort of nearly 20% the nurses want. We've also got to look at this really within the mind of actually what can the country afford, because we can't afford to give everyone huge pay rises, every public sector worker, because that leads to run on inflation, which again brings us back to the original problem we're trying to solve here. But actually a fair pay rise in line with inflation, I think.
Oh, so you're trying to be reasonable here, saying let's meet halfway. I mean, is that the right response? I mean, I think Callum has a brilliant point, which is that if you then are seen as a government to give in and give 19%, then everyone else from border force through to passport control will then say, actually, I do want 19% as well. And then, of course, you then get increased inflation because, of course, you then push up the wages. And, of course, there are two different types of inflation. But at the moment, the country is already suffering from the huge spending, or as we know, from COVID. So So how robust should the government be?
No, I think it's a really, really good point about run on inflation. We can't give everyone pay rises above inflation because that does just lead to further inflation. And so what we need to do is we need to be careful. We need to ensure that our policies are measured and balanced. And I think when you mentioned there in terms of the times of strike, you know, I think nurses themselves, and they will admit, they feel guilt about it. It's not something they necessarily want to do, and that's why there's been such a delay until they've striked. You know, that it has been a long, long time since the last strike, and it's not something they intend to do, but I think we shouldn't use that guilt in order to prevent nurses from asking for, you know, fair pay. And what the government have offered, I don't think is a fair deal. What was 4% or something?
Well, the independent pay review body, basically, which is independent, has said it should be 4.75%.
Right, but I disagree with that. I think I don't think that's reasonable considering the hardships that they're facing and what they've done over COVID. And even though, you know, financially it's really difficult for the country, and I really understand that and I really sympathise, and that's why, you know, I don't think it's fair to expect a 19.2% increase. There has to be some movement and some more negotiation.
Let's move on to the ambulance strikes as well, because they're taking place on the 21st and the 28th. My biggest concern is here, what you do is you rank people into categories, and we now believe that actually, if you are elderly, if you fall, if you break your hip where you're likely to die, you will not get an ambulance.
I'm really worried about it. You know, my grandma, for example, you know, I worry about her. You know, it's really, really icy at the moment. It's difficult conditions. You know, it's not particularly safe. She hasn't been leaving the house as a result because she's so worried about slipping.
Are you near to her?
What do you mean in terms of...
So that you can pop round?
Not particularly, no. Thankfully, she's moved down to Birmingham from Birmingham a few years ago, but, you know, she's still quite far away. It's difficult, and she's worried. And so, you know, having the infrastructure there to support people is really, really important, and it is a great concern. And, you know, putting in the military, you know, costs 5.6 million a week. How sustainable really is it? I'm not sure.
I mean, you make a great point, and actually, Callum, we saw the Chief of Defence Staff, this is Sir Tony Radakin, basically saying, hang on a minute, the armed forces, we're not there to fill in for people who are striking, particularly ambulance workers. They're mobilising 1,200 armed forces to replace the ambulance and the border force. And he came out with this great line where he went, actually, we've got a job to do. We're busy.
I think it's a very fair point. Actually, there's a wider point here about the ethics of strike breaking.
You think that the soldiers shouldn't break the strikes?
No, sorry, the soldiers should not be used...
Right.
...to
But
break
how
strikes.
will people get to hospital?
Well, the government can cough up.
but hang on a minute. So the government says we're not bowing to your pay demands. They stop working. There are no ambulances. So I don't want to be harsh and say, are you happy for people to die? But you're essentially saying if the government says we're not going to move and the ambulance workers aren't going to provide that service, surely someone has to.
Well, this is the thing. So you're stuck between an immovable object and an unstoppable force. And actually, the really important thing here is actually the government is refusing to negotiate in good faith.
I think, to be fair to the government, they said they wouldn't. They are open for talks, was I think their wording.
Unless the ambulance drivers and nursing unions are openly lying, then, which I think it'd be unfair to say they are, then actually the government haven't been negotiating in good faith. OK, so let's say the government stick to their position, though, and the ambulance workers aren't then going to provide that service. Someone has to provide that service, because people will die. Ultimately, the government has an election to fight in a couple of years. Ambulance service.
But I'm talking about the here and now.
Ambulance drivers don't.
I'm talking about his grandma. So his grandma falls over. I hope she doesn't, by the way. But say his grandma falls over and breaks her hip. Yeah. Who's going to look after her? He's nowhere near. No, I do sympathise with the individual cases, but actually we've got to look at... Stop being a politician. Who is going to take her to hospital? That's the question. I'm going to be a politician because these are complex questions that require complex answers. But who is taking her to hospital? You can repeat the question as much as you like, David, but that doesn't change the fact that the government's refusing to negotiate in good faith. Right, but what do we do? I'm a medic by training. Yeah. Renee is one as well. But what do we do? So surely someone fills in. So the military are mandated. The reason I'm asking that question is soldiers, there's a huge hypocrisy here, because of course soldiers have one of the smallest pays and they can't strike, they don't have a union, so a squaddie earns about 21,000 and a paramedic earns, just out by the way, a recently qualified paramedic, about 27,000. Doesn't seem fair. I mean, we're talking about different skill sets. I think the other thing is actually squaddie soldiers are, whilst doing a fantastic job for our country, there are other perks that come with the job. Sure. As well, so it's unfair to look at them in terms of gross pay versus gross pay. Jonathan, I'm just asking your view. You know, we do always turn to the military, and these men and women who serve our country deserve some time off.
No, I think, look, it's really important that, you know, they also, as you said, they have a job to do. You know, it's not a solution. It's not a permanent solution by any means. And I think, you know, seeing it as such would be a grave mistake. It's expensive for our own country's finances, you know, costing 5.6 million a week. It's not sustainable. And with these sorts of issues, we're talking about, you know, who's going to do this. Ultimately, we just have to be sensible, because at the end of the day, you can't use someone's guilt of not working because, you know, their job is whatever really, really important to exploit them. You can't do that to, you know, ensure that their pay is cut and that they can't, you know, afford to buy and heat their homes or put food on their table, or they're choosing between the two. At the same time, we need to ensure that they are there and they're not, you know, able to exploit the system either. So there has to be some sort of clear compromise based on what's reasonable, and both sides need to come to the negotiating table properly and in good faith.
I was just going to say, in terms of the public, they are behind the nurses, but interestingly, the latest, I think it's a Savanta survey, shows that actually they're the only service they're behind. So that's interesting in itself. Let's move on now and talk about something else. And I'm just quite interested, as young people, what you think about this. It's about cocaine, and I wasn't actually suggesting there's a link between young people and cocaine. But so basically, as you know, the government is trying to toughen up drug laws, and at the same time, the police seem to be taking a rather different stance. Now, that is much more in accordance with where I sit and certainly what I've seen. So essentially, the story is that first-time users of cocaine and cannabis would avoid prosecution. This is under a national blueprint being drawn up by police chiefs to treat it as a public health problem. So if you're caught in possession of an illegal drug, so that's Class A and Class B drugs, you wouldn't be prosecuted, but you would be offered the chance to undergo educational treatment programs. And these are 14 of the 43 police forces already doing something similar to this. And essentially, this is coming together to say, we are losing the war on drugs. We need to actually treat people who are using these drugs as people who have a public health problem, and rather than actually, I suppose, pushing them back into the judicial system. That is completely against Suella Braverman. Where do you stand, Jonathan, as a libertarian?
I'm not a libertarian, actually.
Okay, where do you stand?
But it is definitely a topic that I am passionate about, and I definitely think what has just been passed is really sensible, you know. I think the war on drugs has been an absolutely catastrophic failure. I don't think it's succeeded in any respect. If we go back, for example, to, you know, the 1930s and 1940s, the British system was categorically different. We treated these as a matter for the doctors, not a matter for the judges, and as a result, there were, 328 people who were registered heroin addicts at the time. Then, during the 60s and 70s, we started adopting more US-style system, which we were tough on drugs and tough on crime, and as we look as a result, you know, our prisons are filling up with people in there for drugs. It costs nearly £50,000 a year to keep someone in prison, okay? Think about the cost to the government, and when we're currently facing a cost of living crisis that could be saved through, you know, things which obviously I think are completely wrong. You know, I've never used any illegal drugs myself. I'm not just saying that because I'm on TV, like I genuinely haven't, and I don't support and don't, you know, condone the use of them, but I just don't think it should be a crime in which we put people in prison for. And I think it's really, you know, not a sensible thing. It's not a thing that society sees as a crime. We've just seen, you know, a story where potentially there's traces of cocaine in Liz Truss's flat or something. I don't know. I think that might be rubbish, but I don't know. But I don't think that it's something that's sensible, and I think, you know, when we're already having huge amounts of strain on our police service, spending time on drugs, is that really our number one priority for putting someone in prison for, you know, possession or supply of marijuana? I don't think so.
So, Callum, where do you sit on this? Because to me, this is, I mean, I've said for a long time, the drug classification is completely ridiculous as far as I'm concerned. They're all lumped into different groups. When Professor Nutt actually was asked by the government to reclassify them, he came back and said, right, we're going to change it all. The government didn't like what they heard, so they fired him. So clearly, as Jonathan says, we're losing the war on drugs. My personal view is I think that actually I would welcome some form of decriminalisation so that we have safe supplies. I know kids, young people will take drugs. We know that. I'd rather they took a drug, they know what's in it, rather than cut with all sorts of stuff. And also, it seems to me rather ridiculous that if you take ecstasy, for example, you could face 7 years in prison as a result of that, in terms of being or found in possession with a certain amount of it. I don't know where you stand on that, and certainly what the Lib Dem position is on drugs.
So our position is pretty clear. We're in favour of legalising cannabis and...
Legalising?
Like legalising...
Not decriminalising, right.
Legalising cannabis, but we're in favour of decriminalising every other drug.
Interesting. And would you tax them?
Well, if you're decriminalising, you're not in a position where you can tax it. Okay. Because it's a decriminalised product rather than a legalised
and the thinking behind that?
If you look at the Portuguese model, you can reduce things like dirty needle infections. You can increase things like health outcomes. I mean, as a doctor, you come at it from a medical standpoint. I think that's a really important way to look at it. I also think it's really important that you've got the Conservative government being quite hardline on drugs. At the same time, Liz Truss allegedly has a trace of cocaine at Chevening, which would go somewhat to explain the mini budget. But also, we practiced that joke earlier.
Did it? It's a good joke.
Thank you.
It's a very good joke.
But actually, it's rank hypocrisy. Like, and you've seen any number of politicians in the House of Commons from any party who have taken drugs on that estate. The evidence on that one's fairly incontrovertible. Like, let's be realistic here. People take drugs. I would rather, as an education professional myself, be able to be really honest with students about the effects of drugs and actually go, here are the places you can go for help, rather than it being a criminal issue. Because that way, I don't want to have my kids falling through the cracks, because that is...
I mean, and certainly from a medical point of view, what we see is the side effects of people who don't know what they're taking. These sudden deaths.
It means ensures you can regulate what's in drugs to make sure, you know, the really harmful effects are, you know, in smaller doses. You can raise taxation through legalising drugs, you know. It doesn't mean that it's coming through corrupt, you know, means from abroad where there's kickbacks for officials preventing development in other countries, and, you know, people who are the most brutal are basically getting rewarded if you have a really tough approach, because it discourages competition. So if we think about it just from an economic perspective, it makes quite a lot of sense, I think, you know, the legalisation of marijuana, even though obviously there are some challenges. And I think having that sort of educational framework in which it's focused, you know, as a matter for a doctor, or like rehabilitation focused rather than simply being, you know, you're a criminal.
So what I don't understand is that, you know, all of us are involved in politics in one way or another, and yet we all agree that this is the right way to go and the government is totally wrong. Why is the political orthodoxy just continuing with the same ridiculous policy?
I think a fair point. I think to an extent, we are inherently quite small-c conservative as a country. We don't like big sweeping changes, and if you proposed legalising marijuana, which actually fairly mainstream, that would be fine now. But if you proposed decriminalising something like heroin, you can imagine the front pages. The government would plummet in the polls, and that's a government of any colour. Yeah. So people just don't have the political willpower to do it, and also maybe people just have bigger priorities. Despite the fact we're facing a cost of living crisis, we have a chance to increase our tax revenue plus cut prison and NHS cost. Why on earth are we not doing that?
I do want to ask you one other subject very, very quickly. In terms of private schools, Labour's policy basically to add VAT to private fees, for or against?
Against, I say, on the whole, because obviously you've already got a system in which encourages, you know, some sort of elitism, but you're just making it more elite. Even the head of the Sutton Trust doesn't agree with it, so I'm not sure it's the right way of going about things.
Callum, do the Lib Dems have a policy on private schools?
We do. It was actually the one Labour stole a couple of months ago when they announced their VAT policy on private schools.
So you would add VAT?
Yeah, and the reasons are very clear. So the modelling Labour have produced, which is no one's really arguing with it, is it would add 1.6 billion in VAT plus 104 million in business rates. And that's being sort of reported quite widely. That's 1.74 billion. Now, so Kevin, I can never remember his surname, who released the COVID catch-up package, and announced what the government needs to do, announced that you have to spend £15 billion to catch up the disadvantaged gap. Now, between working class kids and who have suffered through COVID and sort of their middle class.
You're talking about Kevin Collins, I believe.
Thank you, Kevin Collins. Now, 1.74 billion is about 11% of that. That's a not insignificant amount.
Renee made a great point this morning that many middle-class people are using all their income to send their children to private schools, and by adding VAT, what it will mean is they can't send them there. So surely what will happen, they'll go into the state system, and you're going to have to use that money to pay for those kids.
Do you have a tissue for my tears up there? Like, come on, like, are we going to be honest?
About choice?
Like, right, yeah.
Shouldn't it be choice? If
sure.
you want to send your children to a private school?
What sort of car do you drive, David? If you don't mind.
I don't think that has anything to do with
it. No. It's a very important comparison.
Well, I drive an electric car.
Okay, wonderful. Right.
I'd love to know where this is going.
So, do you have the free choice to buy a Ferrari tomorrow?
No, I don't.
Right. That's not taking away your free choice. That's just saying you can't afford something.
No, you want basically a meritocracy. You want everyone to be educated in exactly the same schools.
No.
No?
No one's suggesting that. Well, what I'm suggesting, actually, both as an education professional and commentating on this show, is that we need to focus on improving state school standards.
I agree with that.
So, the best way to do that is, A, more money for state schools, which this model proposes, but actually, B, get parents into state schools who give a damn about their kids' education and actually have them as the driving point as governors. Because there's nothing I, as a teacher, want more than positive relationships with parents. And actually, more parents having a positive impact is great. Now, all that means is that you can't afford to go to your £9,000 a year private school.
I think they're more than that.
Well, some of the cheapest ones are £3,000 a term, going up to £40,000 a term.
Yeah.
Sorry, a year. Sorry, not term. Let's be honest. If you take off that choice and make them go to a state school, you freed up £9,000 a year to spend on tuition, if you so desire. Like, there are other choices out there. I'm not particularly sympathetic to the plight of middle-class parents in private schools.
Interesting. I'll be interested to see how middle-class parents vote after that answer. Jonathan, your thoughts?
So a few things. Firstly, the fact that they can afford tutoring means surely there will still remain massive inequalities because, you know, you'll have parents who can, you know, tutor their kids' way into Oxbridge, and so, you know, the positive discrimination that Oxbridge are currently employing, for example, will not, you know, be as clear. In some ways, you know, they can, at the moment, discriminate by prioritising state schools because it's quite obvious that, you know, the level of education there is probably less high and the teaching ability in the environment is more difficult to thrive in. But, you know, if you have everyone at state schools and then certain people receiving, you know, 12 weeks of private tuition, that as well makes it really difficult for unis to actually discriminate fairly. So that's one point. And also...
Very quickly.
Sorry. and also, you know, I just don't think financially it's a sustainable model because it just places huge pressure on private schools.
It doesn't. We have pupil premium and free school meal figures. Schools are legally obligated to statistically record those numbers. We can pass them on to universities. That argument just doesn't stack up in fact.
OK, gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. Very good to see both of you, Jonathan Gibson, Callum Robertson, and they are today's Future Politics panel.
The Future Politics Panel.
Oh, brilliant stuff, brilliant stuff. Love young people involved in politics, and I love that debate discussion and the fact that we can all disagree and agree to disagree as well. After the break...